were still operating without a liquor license 3 years later, thus leaving these establishments that were safe spaces and homes to queer individuals open to police raids and brutality. This is the story of gay pride, which started not in 1969, but got its name gaining traction in 1969, and especially gasoline was poured on the fire in 1970. The Stonewall Inn was one of the most popular gay bars in New York City at the time. It was a gathering place for people of all different stripes. It was a gathering place for people who were a little bit different, who chose to dress differently. It was a place for people who enjoyed the company of the same gender. It was a place for people who wanted to experiment with their own gender, with their expression, with performance, with art. It also was a very popular space for liberation. And this is what made it uniquely able to be sort of the flashpoint for the sort of a Stonewall uprising that proceeded after June 28th, 1969 for the next 6 days. So, the police in sort of around 1:20 a.m. in New York City arrived at the Stonewall Inn to investigate the, quote, illegal sale of alcohol. And, of course, in 1969, in the United States at least, homosexuality was still considered a criminal offense. So, this in mind, the raid was routine, and interrogation of patrons was routine, and the shutting down of liquor sales was routine. But this specific incident at the Stonewall in 1969, June 28th, was not sort of typical for raids like this to happen, because raids like this were so commonplace at this point in time that it was essentially a given if you were running this sort of establishment that police raids and interrogation of clientele and all that kind of thing was just like what was done. So there were many people who were being prepared to be interrogated. There were people who were detained, and then there was also this sort of like growing crowd outside the bar while certain people were being let out and certain people were being kept in, preparing for like arresting them, interrogating them, detaining them. These were very sort of not, they were meant to inspire fear. So this whole idea of like detaining people, interrogating them, using force, arbitrary sort of requirements, like you need an ID, that kind of thing, it was very sort of commonplace for the police at this time to be enforcing these raids in such a obtuse manner, because that is what they felt they needed to do because of the sort of menace that that these people who would patronize these establishments were to society. Of course, why wouldn't we interrogate and detain them? They must be doing cross-dressers often were the most commonly detained and interrogated and had the most sort of violence enacted upon them when that did happen. And there were a good few on this specific night that were able to escape, but there were tussles, and eventually resistance became sort of the theme of the night, and people stayed on for 3 or 4 hours in some cases, resisting, and this sort of early resistance was the kind of, it lit a small match that would eventually be thrown onto the gasoline canister that was this sort of gay rights, gay liberation movement. And so by the evening of June 28th, so now we're talking, the day has gone by and now it's the evening again, still Saturday, June 28th, that there was a crowd of protesters that had gathered around the bar, and the protests, they continued on, and eventually this sort of broke out into fighting and mass police resistance and things like that. And I think it's really important for us to know that this was a space and a movement that was mostly constructed by transgendered people, although the idea of being transgendered was not, at least that term wasn't popularized. If you were sort of thinking in this way, it was more how we conceptualize gender nonconformity these days, where you have people who would think of themselves as transsexuals, you would have people who thought of them as cross-dressers, and this terminology, it is very important for us to remember that although in some cases these terms have fallen out of use or they have taken on possibly an offensive context, I think it is valuable for us to learn what these terms meant, because if we understand our history, we can better inform our contemporary sort of society. And so there were drag queens, there were queer youth, there were people who did not conform to the gender binary, and especially lesbians. They were hugely important to the gay liberation movement that sort of sparked after the resistance at Stonewall on June 28th. Ooh, sorry for bumping the camera, but I think it is so important for us to recognize all of this. So it was very commonplace for lesbians and drag queens and transgendered people and gender nonconforming people to be singled out by the police, because there was this idea at the time, and there was sort of a policy at the time, that no more than 3 clothing items on your body could be sort of read as not being of your gender, which is ridiculous. Like, does that, like, if, for example, myself, as a person who identifies as a man, if I was wearing a skirt, like, this, and I'm kind of going through my notes document here, so if you see me reading, that is what I am doing. So, after the Stonewall Uprising, this sort of 6 days of resistance in June and July of 1969, there was this need for something greater. So, at sort of this flashpoint in queer liberation history, and there is this idea that there should be a demonstration held annually on the last Saturday in June in New York to commemorate this, this uprising, and this is sort of paraphrased from the a declaration, a resolution that was come to by the ERCHO conference in, I believe, November of 1969, and so the demonstration that would commemorate the 1969 uprising would be called Christopher Street Liberation Day, and the Stonewall Inn, of course, is on Christopher Street, and that was the origin point for the uprising. Now, this was already sort of envisioned as a wide-reaching sort of day of celebration and protest. Essentially, it was this thought that queer organizations all over the United States would be like, we've got this, we're gonna all sort of gather together in our cities on this day to commemorate the bravery of the queer individuals at the Stonewall Inn uprising. So, on June 28th I shouldn't say June 28th, but on the last Saturday of June 1970, of course, the first instance of a pride parade happened, and that was sort of the Christopher Street Liberation Day sort of celebration and protest, and I think it's very, very beautiful how this all came together as a collective effort that was not meant to exclude, but was meant to sort of encompass queerness all over, all across the nation of the United States. And of course, as things have progressed and as things evolved, this movement, of course, spread to Canada. Speaking of Canada, the first sort of pride demonstrations were held in solidarity with pride demonstrations in the United States on 1971, August 28th, 1971, in Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto, sort of gathered outside of Parliament Hill in Ottawa for the first Canadian gay liberation protest. And essentially they came up with these 10 demands for equal rights and protections for queer people across Canada. And there were also, I believe, scattered demonstrations in Vancouver as well. But as soon as 1973 rolled around, there were many different pride events held all over the country. Vancouver, Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, Saskatchewan, Winnipeg, and basically these included arts festivals and marches, and this focus on gay liberation, this idea that we deserve rights and we need them and we are going to seize them. And as sort of movements in the United States and Canada has started spreading, there is this move away from diagnosing homosexuality as a disorder and moving away from a stigmatization of homosexuality, although that, of course, was huge. It was still, people thought that we were kind of whacked out in ways, and essentially a really good sort of flashpoint in Canada, if we're thinking of the Stonewall Uprising as the flashpoint in the U.S., there is a group of 4 people called the Brunswick Four, who were arrested at a tavern, at the Brunswick Tavern in Toronto, and that these queer people are not backing down, and eventually I believe that charges were brought against the officers who arrested the Brunswick Four, and they were, the charges against the officers were like for brutality, like physical and verbal police harassment. They were acquitted, of course, but that is sort of the first big event in Canadian history where gay people hit the headlines and were asking for their rights to be respected and upheld. And so there were also, in sort of across the 70s, many different, like, pickets and things like that protesting against the media and against the CBC, the Canadian Broadcast Corporation, sort of getting more eyes on the issue and more, say, like, we need liberation here, we need more recognition for us. And I think it's really interesting to see that, like, during this time, violence and raids saw an uptick against queer spaces and things like that. There's 2 gay bars in Montreal that were raided, I believe, in the late 70s, that were raided essentially in a military style, where there's like guns and bulletproof vests, and they do these mass arrests, and the sort of idea of like getting down on these people and trying to put a boot on the sort of chest of this movement. And this was all done because at the time what we call the War Measures Act here in Canada was in effect, because, okay, yes, this was 1977 because it was the October crisis, and the War Measures Act was invoked, so a lot more could be done against the citizenry of provinces, and they just so happened to use that conveniently to begin raiding gay bars, and then crowding these people into holding cells for hours at a time, being forced to take disease tests and being forbidden from contacting their lawyers, and the whole idea of, like, very unlawfully detaining people, things that we often think should not happen in nations such as Canada. But of course, we reserve this kind of violence for our most downtrodden, for Indigenous peoples, for queer peoples, for peoples who don't necessarily fit the norm. And so this kind of sparked a huge sort of backlash in Quebec, where protesters were saying this is a disgusting show of violence, and sort of strong-arming, trying to invoke fear in the queer community. But sexual orientation was finally added to the Quebec Human Rights Code in 1977 is what I have written here, December 16th, 1977, and it essentially made it illegal to discriminate against gays in sort of the employment sphere, the housing sphere, and things like that. And so this was a moment in Canada where the protest against the arrest of all of these queer people in Montreal by essentially military force, and Quebec finally said enough is enough. And so this is the idea, and this idea of adding sexual orientation to a human rights code in provinces eventually took hold all across Canada up until 2001, where I believe everywhere except Alberta, the Northwest Territories, and Prince Edward Island had sort of included this in their human rights code. Of course, Alberta is always the last to do anything because my province is a hellhole. Just kidding. But it kinda is. So, now this sort of comes along with many different reforms. It is no longer legal to bar homosexuals or dismissed, but it was an opportunity for the police to enact violence upon these men, throw them out into the street naked, publicly humiliate them, and essentially draw attention to, look, this is degeneracy, this is what these people, these disgusting queer people are all about. And this show of force and this sort of authoritarian bent against gay people, against queer people, was kind of nakedly shown that day. And it also kind of enshrines exactly why the police across Canada have been historically enemies of gay pride, and why they should be, and very understandably be, excluded from queer events and pride, because they, not very long ago, within my mother's lifetime, were violently fighting against queer liberation and queer rights, and were very violently shaming and humiliating and beating and arresting and detaining queer and gay people. It's just whack and insane to imagine police officers marching in a gay pride parade. If you are a queer police officer in Canada, take off the uniform and march as yourself. Do not march as a police officer. That uniform has enacted so much violence against queer people in history that it doesn't have a place at pride events. And anybody who argues against that is arguing in bad faith. We are ignoring our history as people. And so this Operation Soap has gone down in history as the largest mass arrest in Canada, and only after fucking, like, what is this, 40 years? It was in 2016, I think, the head of the Toronto Police Department formally apologized for the raids, which is like, wow, thanks for doing the bare minimum. So then after Operation Soap, it's like full on, like, we're doing official pride parades, we're doing official lesbian pride parades. There, of course, were RCMP raids against gay men and bathhouses in Edmonton. The Pisces Health Spa raid in Edmonton, Alberta happened, and 56 men were arrested, and then also, like I said, thrown out, abused, and publicly humiliated for being themselves. And also, TV stations ran these names of these people full out on the news for everybody to see. It's hideous. It's hideous. So raids are coined as like the French-Canadian version of Stonewall, where there's sort of violent uprising against police brutality against queer people, which I think is one of the bravest things that you can possibly do. And the 90s are really like the time in Canadian history where queer people see a lot more rights and freedoms afforded to them. And finally, in 1995, two major steps were made. First, same-sex couples gained legal adoption rights in Ontario in 1995, and in 1995, the Supreme Court rules that sexual orientation is added into the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is essentially our version of a Bill of Rights that really encompasses rights and freedoms for Canadians of multiple different stripes. So I think that is that is sort of like a linchpin, and you have sexual orientation being included in the Canadian Human Rights Act in 1996. You have the first transgender arts festival that was held in Toronto, that ran between, I think, 1997 and 2002 or 2003 or something like that. And then in 1998, my birth year, the Supreme Court of Canada rules that provinces cannot legally discriminate against same-sex people because here in Alberta, of course, there was an instructor at, I believe it was King's University College, who was fired because he was in a same-sex relationship, and then, of course, that went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and it's like, not happening, that's done. So, as you have this gay rights push starting to happen, as we get closer to the turn of the millennium, there's a lot of inclusion of same-sex couples and sexual orientation and gender identity being included within the language of the law to protect us. There was an effort in the 90s to sort of enshrine the definition of marriage as between a man and a woman. That was struck down because that was stupid, of course. And as you have sort of the turn of the millennium happening, we've got a lot more sort of freedoms being won for us until you get to 2003, where in 2003, the first same-sex couple in Canada officially legally marries in Ontario. They were the first to be issued a marriage license to legally marry in Ontario, and the Supreme Court, the Ontario Court of Appeals, found that the exclusion of same-sex couples in marriage sort of affairs was in clear violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And, of course, Bill C-38, the Civil Marriage Act, became federal law in 2005 on July 20th, which fully allows same-sex marriage to be fully legal nationwide in every territory and province, and we were the fourth country in the world to do so. So, that is absolutely wonderful. In 2006, the Federal Conservative Party tried to no, we don't want that. And they decided to kind of try to kill same-sex marriage, and 12 of them, including 5 cabinet ministers, broke and voted against that motion to strike down same-sex marriage. So we did it. And then in 2009, was the first